Ani Andrea Riley-Mukavetz Indigenous, Dashkin being Anishinaabe, Kajijak Nadodum, Wayatong Nadon Chaba. My name is Andrea. I am a citizen of the Chippewa of Thames First Nation. I'm Crane Clan. Where I currently live in Grand Rapids, I'm actually from the Metro Detroit area. And what I'd like to say is what I do well is due to the resilience and brilliance of my ancestors and relatives, and what I do poorly is mine and mine alone. So before I truly begin, I just want to take a moment and thank all of my teachers, my family, and my community who have guided me through my research. And those people include Helen Roy, Douglas Taylor, Amanda Weiner, Janan Cotto, Yebashan Oldshield, Marie Richards, Lakota Hobia, Lynn Bardwell, and Ron Yob. Also, thank you to the Grand Rapids Public Library, the Grand Rapids Public Museum, the Seidman House, and Bentley Library, where I conducted research, and all of those wonderful folks helped me find these materials. And so, as always, I come to you with a good heart and in a good way. And so before I begin, I just want to ask one question. Has anyone ever been to the Millennium Park Mounds in Grand Rapids? Just raise your hand. Okay, cool. So part of what I'm going to be sharing today is a story about those mounds and the community activism around them, but also just to kind of share with you, this research I'm sharing was when I was an academic. I was an associate professor at Grand Valley State University, and I was beginning this project on Anishinaabe trails, and this research to me is very near and dear to my heart, and it's research that I share freely with tribal nations in this area for them to figure out how to use it for their own educational resources as well. So I just want to check in to make sure that you all know the kind of spaces and places that I'll be talking about today. So this project came out of my own interest in telling the stories and the lived experiences of the Anishinaabeg, the past, present, and future, through the Anishinaabeg trails and the creation of the highway system. And so what this research revealed was that the trails and the mounds have always been interconnected. And so today I will tell stories about the mounds in Grand Rapids from these perspectives on this slide. The stories from the Gete Anishinaabeg, which is a term or a description of the oldest ancestors, and I'll talk about the reason why I'm using that, that term later on. I'll also be telling stories of the settler violence that occurred of these mounds, and I'll be telling stories of the generations of the Anishinaabeg who worked together to protect these mounds. So I hope this information leads us to develop more concrete ways to support the sovereignty and cultural continuance of local tribal nations people. In my experience, when there is discussion around Indigenous mounds, they're typically discussed out of historical and cultural and regional context. And so often the narrative is as follows, is that the assertion is that mounds were created by a lost people, often the Hopewellian people. Some may or may not concede that there is a relationship between those people and the current Indigenous people of the area. There's also these stories of excavation and vandalism and desecration, and then there's stories of public use. And so for me as a rhetorician, as a historian, as a community engaged researcher and participant, I want to tell a different kind of story. I want to highlight these stories and also use them to tell the story of the creation of Grand Rapids and its relationship to the first people. This is also my canoe when I was wild ricing a few years ago. Yes. So how I want to begin first is I want to talk about the Gete Anishinaabeg trails. And by talking about those trails, what I want to focus on is that our trails were mainly inland and through rivers and high water level systems or streams. Some of these trails were also footpaths. And at times we used the paths of buffalo herds. And so our maps were not written, but passed down and remembered. And we used our seasonal practices and our life ways to guide us. I'm going to practice this cadence of like walking back and forth over here. And so this right here is one elder named Frank Sprague, who sent me this picture here. And here is a settler couple as well. And they are both standing next to these trail marker trees. And so in this picture, Frank is sitting on a marker tree that he found on his way to the UP. And the other image, this is settlers on their property in Grand Rapids. And so the Gete Anishinaabeg would bend and shape young hardwood trees. And there were multiple kinds of marker trees, including trail marker trees, directional trees, sites that would lead us for copper and lead deposits, chipping stations, and caves where we stashed our materials. And so we used these trees to designate our territorial boundaries of agreements we had with different tribal nations regarding travel and hunting and land use. And so these trees also marked freshwater springs and to locate medicinal plants. And sometimes these trails were our waterways, but not always. The Gete Anishinaabeg would pick up their birch bark jiman, or their canoe, and carry it into the next part where the waterway was deep enough to canoe. And so I often think about ancestors picking up their canoe and all of their belongings and walking from one path to another, and how strong they have to be to do something like that. And so multiple modern highways and roads were modeled after these trails. Land surveyors identified these trails as the best places for modernized roads due to concerns around flooding, near settlements and towns, but the whole road is not the actual trail step by step. Surveyors also responded to settler needs who did not want to go through dense forest and swamps, so they changed the paths while still maintaining they were the original trails. And what you're looking at here are a couple examples from a text that I'll talk about later. It's in the Hinsdale Atlas. And these trails here are marking where they are through the state of Michigan, and as you see, going down. And what's interesting to note here is that these trails are also reflective of diplomatic relationships that the Anishinaabeg had with other tribal nations. And what I want to draw attention to is two things, and this is what my obsession is with these trails, is that there is a narrative that we like to tell about Michigan, right? The stories of our highways are our trails, and I'll talk about why we want to tell that narrative in a moment. But what if we really think about the waterways as not always our highway system or our road system, but we're going inland, it actually tells a more accurate story of who the Anishinaabeg are in terms of our seasonal practices and our lifeways. And so the trails and the mounds are interconnected. They were embedded into the trails as resting places, sites of diplomacy, and are also ceremonial. And so where the trails were often at a lower level, the mounds were often built at high water levels. And this was for many reasons. So due to the awareness of flooding during the spring and the early topography of Michigan. And so the Gete Anishinaabeg used the knowledge of water levels to clean and clear camps. And so before settlement and industry, Michigan was actually rolling hills and not flat land. And so one example, which is where I live right now, is by these streets called Godfrey and Cesar Chavez Avenue. I'm not sure if you've been around there, but that area actually reflects the topography of what early Grand Rapids was instead of how we might see it today. And so looking at those early land surveying decisions, I've learned that the placement of mounds often occurred around hemlock trees, birch, white pine, and elm trees. And so when I shared this with Lakota Hobia, who's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for Gun Lake, she shared with me that she thinks that that made sense because it reflected our early diplomatic relationships that the Anishinaabeg had with neighboring nations. And those trees reflected our making practices. We relied on those trees for very certain things, canoes, baskets, medicine, etc., right? And so Grand Rapids had so many council trees, including one on Fulton Street, that city members destroyed around 1900. And so Eric Hemingway, he shares that council trees was a marker tree where chiefs would gather to practice governance and deliberation. And so before the pollution of industry and settlement, Grand Rapids was rich with resources. Around the mountain, the most public knowledge about these mounds, the Norton Mounds, is from a settler perspective. It's stories of settler occupation and of conquest. And I'm going to tell these stories now, but from an Anishinaabeg perspective. And so some of the perspectives that I want to draw from, and specifically calling out some names, are what we might consider our founding Grand Rapids fathers. So we have Campeau, Belknap, Ball, Robinson, Hubbard, all two of them, Coffinberry, Porter, Hinsdale, Flanders, and then Janet Brashler, who is a current archaeologist. And so this is really where one could find the bulk of history on either some of the trails, but mainly about what they refer to as the Indian or the Norton Mounds. And so I apologize that this is a little smaller than I anticipated, so I'll read through each one of them. So I want to connect those contributions or those authors to a timeline of perspectives. So in some of these books or narratives, we get 17th to the 19th century, and the narrative was these mounds were excavated and robbed for scientific purposes. Another one was reflection and trying to understand and speculation on the Hopewell and the lost race. And I really try to resist the Hopewellian term or description to talk about the Mound Builders, because again, I think what it does is it removes the indigenous people of that place, right? It boggles settler mind, I'll talk about this later on, to think that the indigenous people who they interact with now had the kind of technological or scientific brilliance, and they just couldn't comprehend that these people who they see had that ability to do so. They had to make up somebody else instead. There were no laws to recognize the protection of these mounds until about 1990. Archaeologists, anthropologists, land surveyors, and logging and lumber companies are responsible for a lot of the damage of the mounds. The creation of bridges in the late 19th century led to the raising or the flattening of the mounds. The mound near Plainfield, if you've ever been in the Plainfield Road area, that was a trading post, and those were destroyed by lumberjacks. In the 1915, 1960s, 1980s, and 2000s, further excavation occurred. And if we were talking about the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act and set those times up, there would be some hijinks that we could see there. Hence, settler misdeeds. The materials and remains were sent to Grand Valley State University, the Peabody Museum, and the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and still to this day, tribal nations are working for full repatriation. So according to Hinsdale, who created just an extensive atlas in general that is really knowledgeable, this atlas comprises and tells the story of Anishinaabeg villages, trails, camps, and mounds. And he shares that there were 1,668 mounds in Michigan by the early 19th century. And in Grand Rapids, there were about 40 mounds. And so authors like Thomas Porter and Coffinberry argued that these mounds were simply burial sites. Even though we know they were council areas for diplomacy, they were sites for ceremony, sometimes these mounds were embedded as a part of earthworks, which enclosed or referred to larger enclosed structures. Coffinberry and his associate Strong, they excavated 46 mounds. And they published their findings in proceedings with the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1876. And so what they found was that these mounds varied from 2 feet to 15 feet in height, and 10 feet to 102 feet in diameter, so huge mounds. At this time, settlers began to assign meaning to these mounds in a variety of ways. Coffinberry identified the mounds as a refuse heap. They were just used for trash. And they identified, and how he came to that conclusion is he saw shells, ashes, and bones and thought, that's trash. They relied on the memoirs of Rix Robinson, Louis Campeau, and Charles Belknap as the authorities on First Peoples' perspectives and histories. Yet, if you ever read those books, maybe like I do, there are inconsistent reports from all 3 of those folks, Robinson, Campeau, and Belknap. And so in their writings, there's evidence where they acknowledge that the Anishinaabeg were the builder of these mounds, and also when settlers were directly asked about them, they would say their Indian confidants had no idea about these mounds. So while reading through these primary materials, I want to be clear that the goal of these documents was always to catalog and to count. They reported on numbers, dimensions, and locations. All of their analysis about the purpose and culture of the Gete Anishinaabeg is through the speculation and at a time when Euro settlers were not interested in coexisting with the first people. They wanted to eliminate us, and so therefore they were looking at our own cultural practices as a justification to do so. So let's put this into a larger historical context. So at this time, land surveyors, landowners, and founders were making decisions about the future of Michigan and advocating for it to become a state. There was a lot of concern over who was here first. And to maintain the arguments of manifest destiny and American exceptionalism, it benefited settlers to tell another story about the first people, that the Mound Builders were an ancient race who disappeared. And this is at a time when the government was trying to find any evidence that they could that the indigenous people who were here first were gone, and that the people who were here now, the indigenous people who were here now, were less intelligent, more primitive, and they did not have the right to this land or decision-making about this land. Hence, Hope-Willian culture. So this was at a time when the federal government was engaging in treaty making that was duplicitous and non-consensual. So in my research from the early 19th century to the 1980s, I have read countless documents by Grand Rapids settlers and founders who describe the mounds as an Indian problem. And this is important to understand as it reflects the common beliefs of the early 1800s when settlers did not think they could coexist with the first people. And I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of stories we can tell about early mound excavation and preservation. Scientists and land surveyors were interested in these mounds because it told them something about how the first people used this landscape and the natural resources. They would talk about how when they looked into these mounds, they learned about access to copper, they learned about different kinds of lumber and their use, and they also learned how to understand high water areas and flood zones. But they wouldn't acknowledge those contributions from those first people. The mounds told them a story about the kinds of soil that they had there and how the Gete Anishinaabeg hunted, farmed, and foraged, and yet they ignored that narrative and those contributions also. Instead, they would pivot and I'm gonna make a generalization here, that we, my ancestors, were not human to these people. They could not understand the contributions that my ancestors had. We were solely objects to study, categorize, and then send to museums and universities to display as symbols of conquest. So going further into how this context impacts Michigan and Grand Rapids. So in my research, land surveyors, geologists, and geographers, it becomes very clear that the roads, the water levels, and the topography of Michigan was a problem for settlers. French settlers from the 17th and 18th century did not create these roads. Instead, they used the trails of the Anishinaabeg, and they would canoe alongside the coast of the Great Lakes. Our trails were foot trails and herd trails that they traveled mainly inland through thick forests. And the challenge here is that they wanted to use wagons, but those trails were not suitable for wagons. And so in the 19th century, there was a lot of discussion on who would create roads. Settlers would not come to Michigan until there was a more fully established travel system that made sense for their understanding of time, mobility, and technology. They also needed surveyors to raise the land and make it flat. They needed wetlands, swamps, and bogs to be filled in because they did not understand how to farm or live among the original landscape of Michigan. So for example, I told you I'm from the east side. In one of the things I read, one of my favorite anecdotes from a land surveyor is that Royal Oak, I'm not sure if you know about Royal Oak, which is where my husband and I grew up, was actually 20 miles of a cranberry bog. And it took settlers 3 days to travel around it in order to get to now is what we understand as Pontiac. So just thinking about this narrative of highways and trails and these mounds and the need to change the landscape is because it's reflective of the belief, the values, and the knowledge of settlers and their lifeways at that time period. So here's a bird's eye view map of Grand Rapids in 1868. So as you can see here, these are our little islands. These were still a part of the Grand River in 1868. They're gone now, or filled in. Sometimes they resurface, but they're not the same islands. And so the early construction of Grand Rapids was designed to appeal to trading. They used the Grand River as a sewer to ship raw materials. And what I hope becomes clear is that for settlers of Grand Rapids specifically, they were completely uninterested in learning how to live with an already established ecosystem and topography, and instead created a new landscape that reflected a domination over nature and people. And so looking at where these islands are, actually this is where our Amway buildings are built, our DeVos buildings are built as well. That's another story for another day. Okay. So here's Millennium Park. So I was asking, do you know about Millennium Park? Here's our Norton Mounds. Norton Mounds. So the creation of bridges, railroads, and roads were interconnected to support industry and settlement. The first rail line through this area was the Chicago and Michigan Lakeshore Railroad in 1869. In 1873, a landowner allowed the corridor to pass through his property, which is about 250 feet of the easternmost mound. So, right here. So so Janet Brasher, she's an archaeologist, she argues that moment of that industry and settlement, that was the first serious brush with historic era disturbance. But I would disagree with that. And instead, I would argue that the creation of trade posts and early robbing and excavation of those mounds was instead. And so we can see this actually through the creation of the highways. So now I'm going to go to 131, our favorite road in the world. So the creation of highways is a story of settler colonialism and environmental injustice, gentrification, and white supremacy. When US 131 was created, it was created like all highways to support high volumes of traffic, to leave urban areas, and so drivers did not have to go near what politicians referred to as slum areas. If looking at a map, one can see that what this highway goes through, right here, is actually the key villages, that's what these dots are, and the sacred sites of the Gete Anishinaabeg. So when 131 was built in 1926, it was done without the input of the community. It displaced residents, and to authorize the creation of this highway, they reinforced the story, and they made an argument that the highway was the best location because it reflected the old Gete Anishinaabeg trails. And so I'm not sure, again, if you've ever heard this narrative largely about Michigan, but 196 is another narrative about that. That's another story, another book, another time. But this was the larger narrative that continued from the 1920s to the 1960s, and that's how you promote that manifest destiny kind of narrative. So from the 1920s to around 1970, the city of Grand Rapids owned and had dominion of the mounds. According to Chief Curator Alex Forrest, the city owned the parcel since the late 1920s when it was acquired from the Parks and Boulevard Association. Additionally, parcels were owned by the Kent County Road Commission, and it was deeded to the Grand Rapids Gravel Company and other city and private companies. In 1970, the Grand Rapids Public Museum began to manage this land through a lease agreement. Throughout this time, there have been different interpretations of stewardship. Additionally, the city approached the mounds like they did the Grand River at that time. It was used more like a sewage or a spot to claim dominion over to sustain the building of industry. So from the 50s to the 90s, there were oil wells, mining companies, landfills, private dumping, produce companies, a glass factory, and gravel mining. This is me showing the receipts of that. So basically what you can see is who's owning it and then what it's for. So like oil and gas deed, Rex Oil and Gas Company, land transfer relating to 196 construction. And so this is how you can see the transfer over to the use, right? So I'm about to move on to another set of stories. But before I do that, in my research, it became clear that the city saw the mounds as untapped potential for profit. And also, without that material, without the interventions of neighborhood associations, anthropologists, and museum directors, I would not have had as much access to this information and history. Without early intervention, all of these mounds would have been filled or raised and replaced with highways and other industrial development. I truly do not think that there are added benefits to settler colonialism. Never gonna say that. There's no bright side. These are just the products in which we live in and endure. There were other options of cohabitation that the Gete Anishinaabeg offered, and settlers ignored them, and they continue to ignore them today. And so these clips here are actually from my research in the public library that actually shows the neighborhood associations, the archaeologists making these arguments for trying to keep these mounds. And so I think, again, from that Anishinaabeg perspective, we gotta hold space for all those stories at the same time. So, where am I? Hold on. Aha, okay. So I mentioned before that settlers described the mounds as an Indian problem. Yet it was not because of the mounds as a problem, but because another generation of Anishinaabe were seeking to hold the city accountable for grave robbing, displaying of ancestral remains, and just general cultural insensitivity, thank you, and lack of community input and consultation. And so I'm gonna tell those stories now. And these are my favorite stories. So first, I want to begin with a story that community member and 1974 editor of Turtle Talk, Elder Shirley Francis, who's now walked on, wrote about Grand Rapids and the mounds. And this is a story that she wrote. Scene 1. It is 2,000 years ago. A grand river flows in the broadly angling way that rivers do, through a wide, low-key valley. not far beyond the last rapids on its way to a great lake. The lush greenery that decks the banks gives way to a clearing. Here, up from the river's edge, 200 yards or so, some 17 mounds rise gracefully to varying heights from a grassy, blossom-filled meadow. Closest to the river are small ones, elevated a mere 2 or 3 feet. Beyond, larger ones rise to 15 feet. The random patterning of their size and spacing is a pleasant contrast to the carefully laid out adjacent village to the left. The bright morning sun combines with the dew to give a crystalline shimmer over all. The village is already bustling with activity, but this day is different from yesterday. For countless generations, the village have gathered her brood of mounds to her guarding, nourishing, and mending them. In return, they have provided numerous generations of children a safe place to play, and many generations of courting couples a rendezvous in their shadows. Today, this has ended. The village and the mounds must part. The last great chief has died. The last basketful of dirt has been laid carefully onto the last mound. Beneath 20,000 hand-carried basketfuls of earth, his body has been laid to rest forever. The mound people are preparing to leave. Perhaps the chief left no heir, and the people have elected to return to their ancient capital many days to the south. Perhaps the climate has grown colder, causing crops to fail and their numbers to diminish. The sturdier may have become hunters and gatherers, eventually wandering far to the north, where all memory of the mounds was lost in the everyday struggle for life. There surely must have been a good reason for their leaving the mounds, for moving away. Everything is packed. First, the people must say goodbye, strolling through their beloved mounds, cradling for the bones of their ancestors. They whisper a prayer for the happy repose of the spirits that hovered near. The mound spirits hover above, waiting, waiting, seeing someday, someday, the people will return. Yes, they will return. Scene 2. The years have come and gone 2,000 times. The mounds are caught in a gigantic triangle. The river forms the base, churning sluggishly except in the spring, when it creeps up like a giant blob, spreading mire and ooze up the once pleasant meadow, almost to the mounds themselves. The acute side of the triangle is formed by the expressway, on which speeding vehicles whine, belch fumes, and sometimes ride themselves of torn tire treads and rotten mufflers. The third side, where once the village stood, has been gouged out, forming a water-filled gravel pit. Some of the mounds are gone. Now large trees top the biggest, their roots worming their way to the very heart of each. Motorcycles have lashed deep scratches through the grassy covering. Trash litters the ancient meadow. Rats fight over the garbage spilling from numerous plastic bags. A torn mattress has become a breeder for vermin. From time to time, visitors arrive to clean up, to discuss remedies, or replace the sign. Leaving, they shake their heads sadly or clench their fists in frustration. Scene 3. Not far from the mounds, a great metropolis has risen up. There, in a building, gather some 70 people who have responded to a call for an organization to be formed that will do something about the mounds. They will call themselves the Friends of the Mounds, and they will plan a way to make the mounds a safe, sacred place again. The descendants, now called Native Americans, are there. But most are newcomers to the Grand River and its valley, and there are new ways for working together. They form clusters. One calls itself the Museum Association, another the Museum Officials. One is called the Anthropologists. Another is known as the Local Archaeological Society. One cluster is made up of just plain citizens, but all recognize the priceless heritage of the mounds. All realize there is no other place like the mounds in this entire peninsula, now christened Michigan. But interest has been shown before. Will this new group be able to sustain itself among the trials facing it? Protecting the mounds from further desecration will require time, money, talent, effort, and dedication. All about the mound spirit's weight. Perhaps, just perhaps, the people are returning. And so I wanted to read that in full for a couple reasons. One, I believe it's important to honor the contributions and intellect and stories of our ancestors and our elders. And it's written at a time frame where, again, there was little recognition of the intellectual contributions of Native people, especially Native women. But also what I hope you noticed was that she told the story in 3 arcs, the way that I also just did. The Gete Anishinaabeg, the settler occupation and misdeeds, and what I'll now get into is the activism. And so Turtle Talk, so I've reviewed hundreds of these newsletters that were written from the Anishinaabeg from the 1960s to the early 00s. And what they did was they advocated for policy, they talked about the powwow trail, and it reflected the activism of our elders from that time period. And they were just darn good writers too. I want to highlight examples of local activism in the mounds where community members worked with the American Indian movement to defend and clean up the mounds. At this time, a group called the Concerned Indians of Michigan, the Friends of the Mounds, and other tribal nations people were pressuring the state and the federal government to be more culturally sensitive around the excavation of mounds and villages. They would actually show up to archaeological society meetings, city commission meetings, and so on to rile things up and to make their perspective visible. So they would make the news constantly like this regarding the cleaning up and protecting of the mounds when it was used as a dump site. And as I would continue to read these, it was very interesting because the narrative was very complicated, where the journalist would be documenting what would occur, but then at the same time, there was a mixed feeling of, oh, these troublemakers, right? Oh, these troublemakers. And so their efforts resulted in the presence of Indigenous people on advisory councils for excavation. Their presence and activism resulted in NAGPRA. So in other words, up until the 1970s, there were no policies to include, consult, or inform Indigenous people of excavations. It was completely acceptable to remove and display remains until these Native people themselves made a stand. And one of my favorite things is this group, the Concerned Indians of Michigan. When I was at the archives at University of Michigan, I learned about them. And then I went to Facebook because that's the best source of communication for Native people. And I was like, does anyone know about the Concerned Indians of Michigan? And no one's like, no, we do not. But they were on some lists, y'all. Like they made people angry, and I want to know more about them. Like, I want to know. So I want to draw attention to one example of this advocacy that I'm talking about. So from the 1960s to the 1970s, there was a city commission committee on the mounds. Until 1975, there was no Native people on that commission. And I want to acknowledge the elders who comprise that committee now. So we have John Bosden Jr., Frank Bush, Ron Yob, Lawrence Shenaniquet, Isaac Peters, June Gorman, Michael Dominic, Fred Chivish Jr., and Rosalie Starr Chief. These elders put forward agenda items like removing ancestor remains from public display at the museum, and to transfer the custody of those remains to the museum and tribal nations, so moving them to tribal nations themselves. That last request was actually denied by the City Commission in Grand Rapids, which was made of public servants, archaeologists, and museum directors who chose to listen to archaeological societies and academics who demanded they needed to study these remains in the name of science. So again, my commitment to trying to honor and recognize and make visible elder stories is crucial and something we should consider to do when we tell the stories of history, because they continue to be obfuscated. I'm almost done. So as I end here, I want to return to the idea of sovereignty, story, resistance, and survival. For me, the stories of the Gete Anishinaabeg, the stories of our pathways, are stories of sovereignty, resistance, survival, and cultural continuance. I hope that what becomes clear is that the Gete Anishinaabeg and their later generations always worked in multiple strategies to protect, educate, and care for these mounds and our communities, whether academics, politicians, and museum directors included them or not. So, and the ways that they had done this was through these kinds of policies and practices. So like the Michigan Indian Tuition Waiver, the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Indian Arts and Crafts Act, and this is the NAGPRA Act, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And so, trying to understand and trying to put this in a context is a story of the mounds, a story of the trails, is really a larger context of these kinds of policies that held other groups of people accountable. Okay, I'm done now. So thank you so much for listening.